Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate the launch of a new edited volume, Sufism in Canada, which was published by the University of British Columbia Press and just came out, I think, last week officially. So we're gathering some of our editors who are actually joining us globally. We have some folks joining from Pakistan, from Denmark, from Toronto, so from everywhere. It's a pleasure to have you. And this event is co-sponsored by CSSR, which is the Canadian Society for the Study of Religion, and CASIM, which is the Canadian Association for the Study of Muslims and Islam and Muslims in Canada. And so we'll house kind of the recording of this on both. And so we want to thank both organizations for supporting and celebrating this work. So what I'll do is I'll say a little bit about the volume itself, just a few minutes to talk about the inception and kind of the idea of it. And then we'll turn it over to some of our contributors who have joined us. Not everybody could be here today, but many are here. And so they'll speak for about 5 minutes or so about their chapter and what they wanted to contribute to the volume. And then Dr. Mark Sedgwich, who has joined us, he will respond to kind of the volume as a whole. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. And so you feel free to either post questions on the chat or to raise your hand towards the end. So this volume, actually, Geneviève and I were just talking with Marcia before we opened up the event. It was kind of an inception from when Marcia Hermansen and Elliot Bassano did an edited volume on varieties of Sufism in the United States and America. That's how Jen and I got connected through that. And at that time, I was starting to think a little bit about Sufism in Canada, actually with my colleague, Rory, who's also on the call. And that was kind of a moment where things were circulating. We had tried to apply for various kinds of funds, but it didn't really work out at the time. And I had started working on a book on the Dervishes of the North, which came out a couple of years ago, which is the first book on Sufism in Canada. And while I was researching that, it kind of came into my mind that it would be really great to synthesize or bring some of these folks that I've been meeting together. So it was a big kind of idea that I emailed Jen about, because she's been working a lot on Sufism in Canada during her MA and her PhD. And I asked her if she'd be interested in it, and she probably foolishly at the moment said yes, because co-editing is a big task. But we kind of embarked on that journey together, and we started sending out emails to amazing, wonderful scholars, and many easily said yes and really wanted to contribute. It wasn't even that difficult to pull people's legs. There were maybe one or two people for various reasons weren't able to contribute, but that was the inception of the project, and we kind of left it open to what people could write about. And then from there, we essentially brought kind of categories in terms of the chapters that came up. So there's 3 sections of the edited volume. The first section deals kind of with historical setup a little bit. The middle section deals with praxis or rituals and practices. And the last section, which I think is quite novel in terms of the field, are more of autoethnographic reflections, which we're really excited about. And so collectively, what the book does is looks at certain communities, right? The Naqshbandi Haqqani community or the Jarrahis in Toronto. Others look at microhistories, and others also look at kind of personal reflections of where folks are coming from in terms of practice for themselves. We wanted to make sure that the volume captured a range possibilities of how to think about Sufism in the Canadian context, being the first edited volume. And we wanted to go also into granular details. I think because it's such a new field, and taking kind of example from other scholars such as Mark and Marcia and Rory, who have really worked on thinking about Sufism in European context and the Western context, we wanted to kind of take the lead and think about what it means to capture some of the microhistories, the granularities of Sufi communities, before we could start kind of theorizing in broad strokes about what this looks like. And so the intention really is hopefully that this is the first of many to come, and that it might inspire a lot of other scholars who are not only working on Islam in Canada, but also scholars who are working on spirituality and new religious movements and popular spirituality. I think the tendency has been to kind of keep those separate. And perhaps the thing that we're doing that's a bit radical, and perhaps people may, be resistant or critical to it, which I think is all valid and important, is trying to figure out how to have conversations across those fields, because there are elements of some of the stuff that maybe scholars who work on esotericism or popular spirituality may be interested in, and others who work more on migration and immigration and diasporic religions are interested in. And we really wanted to bring all of those together, but also be attuned to dynamics of race and gender, institution building, and of people's particular histories and stories. So that gives you a little bit of a setup of the broader project. And what we'll do now is hear from some of the contributors who are present, and they'll speak a little bit about their own chapters and where those their ideas came from those chapters. And then we'll kind of take our conversation from there. So I will turn it over to my co-editor who came along on this journey with me and hopefully is also equally happy and jazzed about the output, Geneviève Mercier-Dalphond. Jen, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, of course, I am so thrilled and I'm so happy to share this moment with you, Shobhana, and everyone, the contributors who have been amazing. Just across this journey, it's just been so fun. It's been an amazing, just experience all along. And I'm so grateful to Shobhana, to you for having brought me along. And this has been just an amazing project. And I do hope sincerely that there'll be more contribution to the study of Sufism in Canada and all its complexities. And for now, I'm going to introduce some of my chapter before turning it to our contributors. So I'll just talk a little bit about my chapter, and then I'll call all the contributors in the order of their chapters. So after I present, I'll call upon Atif to do your own presentation, and then do make sure that you can also present yourselves before you do present your chapter as I called upon you. So my chapter was about sacred landscapes and universal Sufism from Canada to South Asia. So I really tried to explore how the Canadian universal Sufi landscape has been influenced and also is continuously connecting to South Asia. And so I did that by exploring two of the main groups that are the universal Sufi groups in Canada, especially the Inayati order, or the Inayatiya, and the Sufi Circle Canada. So I talk about how they're both rooted, in the lineage of the Muslim Sufi leader Inayat Khan, who died in Delhi in 1927, and whose shrine now in Delhi has become one of a central practice of sacrality within universal Sufi groups for the death anniversary, the Urs of Inayat Khan, which happened in February every year. So I kind of trace my fieldwork through Canadian groups, but also through the sacred landscape now in South Asia through the shrine of Inayat Khan. So basically, this chapter is based on my ongoing fieldwork on Sufism in Canada and South Asia specifically, which I began in 2014, and studying transnational orders and religious connections between Canada and South Asia, which I have been focused a lot on universal Sufism, but also on different transnational groups. So I've been really interested in the ways in which members of universal Sufi groups have reconnected, especially in the past decades, to their group's homeland in India, and through the figure of Inayat Khan and his heritage as a way to really also connect some legitimacy, but also some spirituality. So my first part discusses the lineage of Inayat Khan and the coming of Sufism to Canada from South Asia, which I won't delve into. I think we're in a room where a lot of us have a good grasp of the influence of Inayat Khan in North America. And basically, with the growing of Inayat Khan's, kind of, I call them lineage branches in the 1960s counterculture movement, how that really grew in Canada as well, as the border was also more porous at the time. There was also a lot of, intellectual, but also spiritual movement. And so in the 70s and 80s, you have these universal Sufi branches that initially grew out of Inayat Khan in the US that come to Canada. And also especially, and that's one of the important aspects of my research, is that you have this growth from the 80s onwards from 1975 to 2000 in Canada that are really located in sacred spaces that are in North America through retreats. So you have the Inayati orders, abode of the message in New York, which is a very important center of spirituality, of community for people. And for the Sufi Circle Canada, the other group that I discuss, they have a very important retreat center in the Rocky Mountains around Lake O'Hara. in British Columbia, which was operating from 1982 to 2002. So what we see after 2000, obviously, which I really go more in depth in my chapter, is a change from, the closeness to nature and being present in those spaces of retreats in North America and some as well in Europe, especially in Switzerland and France, and kind of these centers and this mode of spirituality changing and connecting in the globalized world online for the daily practice, but also once a year through this pilgrimage to the Urs of Inayat Khan and the center of spirituality, really going to India as well for people who are practicing. And so I discussed then through fieldwork the Urs of Inayat Khan that I was able to document and the centrality of this practice for members. And so this, I call this a return to South Asia, but I really say it, in parentheses, because I don't think it's an actual return because these things were always in movement. But I think it represents a symbolic and physical kind of, South Asian re-Islamization of the movement. And while these two groups are still universalist in outlook, what I do suggest is that these Sufi groups are increasingly embracing the Islamic and South Asian aspects of their heritage through dress, language, rituals, and collaborations with other Muslim leaders and traditional Islamic South Asian practices. And I go through, qawwalis, but also other forms of, name adoptions. So in conclusion, my chapter kind of illustrates how universal Sufi groups in Canada have changed over the past decades from Western eclectic spirituality in the counterculture movement to South Asian Islamic universalism. So at the heart of this shift is a renewed connection to Inayat Khan's legacy, but also, a rerouting of the rituals, of the aesthetics and the authority of through South Asian Sufism. And these sacred landscapes, both digital and physical, are central to how Canadian Sufis today negotiate their identity, build community, and seek spiritual depth in this kind of pluralistic, globalized world. So that's an overview for my chapter. Now I'm going to pass the mic to Atif Khalil, please, to present your chapter, and do please present also, yourself, and then I'll call to Marcia afterwards.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? First of all, I wanted to thank Geneviève and Shobhana for including me in this fascinating volume. I was really impressed by how well it was put together. Sometimes these edited volumes can be quite internally chaotic and discordant, but this one actually had quite a bit of internal unity and coherency to it. So the volume held together very well. I was very impressed by how well it was edited, and also just the articles were fascinating. Last night I was reading Marcia's article on Joel Krebs, and it was just such an interesting chapter. And then I was really pleased with the way you interspersed your own life experience in Montreal with your interviews with Joel Krebs. I actually happen to know one of the individuals in that volume that was referred to simply by a letter, and I was going to include them in my in my own chapter. I had interviewed that person because this person also has ties to the Helvetii Jarrahis. So there were some interesting overlaps as well, and also with Abdurrahman Malik's chapter at the end. Now, I was introduced to the Jarrahis in the late 1990s and early 2000s when I was a student at the University of Toronto, and I've remained in touch with them since. The chapter gave me an opportunity to gather some of my thoughts together about the Sufi order and put these thoughts together into a sustained analysis of the community. It was also based on interviews with key members of the order. Now, my own writing reflected my position as an insider and an outsider. An insider to the extent that I've participated in the community now for many years and know some of the people in the order quite well, and an outsider insofar as I'm not formally a member of the order. I'm not technically an initiate of the order. That the Jarrahis operate out of their dargah, as it is known in Toronto. The official name of the place is the Canadian Sufi Cultural Center. They hold weekly gatherings there of dhikr, communal remembrance, Sufi talks, Sufi reflection, dinner, and for lack of a better term, spiritual companionship It is a center of spiritual companionship for the Jirahis in Toronto. There are probably about 30 families that congregate regularly, mostly of Turkish and Balkan descent, but also of other ethnic and cultural backgrounds and stripes. There are many Arabs, Afghans, African, and Indo-Pakistani Muslims who come, as well as Euro-Canadian and Afro-Canadian converts. And it is a very family-friendly environment. There are a lot of children running around at the dargah at their weekly gatherings, and they're very welcoming of guests. Now, the community is presided over by Tawfiq Aidonair, known affectionately by the Jirahis as Tawfiq Baba. He's one of the key figures to have established the Jirahis of Toronto with his wife Sadat Dana in the 1990s. Now, this establishment of the Canadian chapter was in many ways an inevitable consequence of the transatlantic spread of the order under the leadership of Muzaffar Effendi, the late Muzaffar Effendi, who visited the United States in the 70s and 80s and was instrumental in the spread of Sufism in the West. Muzaffar Effendi was a charismatic figure who was able to attract Americans to his spiritual message delivered through traditional methods of Sufi storytelling and light-hearted instruction. And he offered a way to God that was unencumbered by dogmatism and ritualism, and which emphasized love and compassion. Now, Tawfiq Baba's own interest in Sufism was sparked by a chance encounter with Muzaffar Effendi in Istanbul, who explained to him the meaning and significance of a mystical experience that Tawfiq Baba had in his 20s, which none of the priests, rabbis, and imams that he had asked about were able to explain to him. The experience bore a strong and uncanny resemblance to what is known in modern parlance as the near-death experience, a term that was made popular by Moody in his book Life After Life, which was the first major study of what is known as the near-death experience. Basically, Tawfiq Baba had something of a near-death experience, which involved an out-of-body experience where he encountered his own higher self. And I explored this event in the book, in my chapter, in some detail, if you're interested in reading more about it. And like I said, none of the spiritual leaders that he consulted were able to give him a satisfying explanation until he met Muzaffar Effendi. That began a journey for Tawfiq Baba that led him to develop close ties to the New York branch of the order led by Tosun Barak, and to eventually establish the Canadian branch of the order. Now, the Jirahis have attracted a lot of very interesting people of diverse backgrounds over the last 3 decades. One of the most active members of their community was the late Janice Ornstein, the Canadian artist, musician, and opera singer, and sometimes child actress. She played the voice of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in the 1964 production of the story, which you can find through a simple Google search online. Now, she developed close relations with the Jirahis in the late 1990s, initially through a musical and cultural performance that was organized in Toronto under the leadership of Abdurrahman Malik. That was actually the subject of his own chapter. And that began her relationship with the Jirahis. Over the course of the 2 decades that she was with the Jirahis, she brought her musical talents to the order. She died in 2010 after an unsuccessful battle with cancer, which I also discussed in the chapter. And with her husband, she produced an album of Turkish Sufi music called Teardrops from the Ocean of Love. Now, the Canadian branch of the Jirahis, to conclude, are a vibrant community with a core group of committed members and families. Having been in operation now for 30 years, some of the children who have grown up in the order are now also taking up leadership roles in the community. And they may also be the most musically refined Sufi community in Toronto. They tend to attract people who are musically inclined and who themselves may be musicians. And this musical element was one of the reasons that Janice was drawn to the order, since the Jirahis see the sacred power of music as a way of stirring up in the soul a longing for God. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was extremely well presented. And thank you again for contributing to the volume. Your chapter is quite interesting. Now I'm going to pass it along to Marcia. And you've already set up the stage for Marcia's chapter. Now people are interested to know.
Hi, everybody. From Karachi. Yeah, I'm Marcia Hermanson, and transitioning out of Loyola University of Chicago to Habib University in Karachi as an endowed chair, Lady Fatima Endowed Chair of Female Divinity. So I'll be commuting between the States and Karachi. So let me quickly, 5 minutes is short and I want to be disciplined. I'll say a little bit about my chapter, and I hope in the future you'll get to read it and enjoy that. And I think it suits the subtitle of the volume, Weaving Islamic Practice and Contemporary Spirituality. I always like to celebrate the Canadian content in my own background. As a native Montrealer, a boomer, and an early spiritual seeker. And I mean, if they were there in Canadian Sufism, I knew them, or I was in New York with Sheikh Muzaffar, or I would, I was there, like, yeah, I saw them all. And so I was there at the beginning of many manifestations of Canadian Sufism. My chapter was written during COVID, and it was actually a great, and I consider a successful experiment because I did it through Zoom interviews with Ibrahim Joel Krebs, also a Montrealer whom I've known since the 1980s. And he and I moved to the States, to the University of Chicago to do a PhD in Islamic studies in the 70s, but I would go back, and actually my family, like many other Canadian, what shall I say, to make it simple, Anglos, we left Quebec in the 60s. So I actually spent a lot of time in Ontario as well, including Toronto. So I got to know the Sufi developments there. And actually my family lived in Kitchener-Waterloo, and believe it or not, there were sort of these incipient, networks of different spirituality that had penetrated even so far. Well, of course, Waterloo is a university town. So Krebs, who I interview in the book, he's actually a psychiatrist, I think now recently retired. He is a great raconteur. And in fact, I thought this chapter was going to be about the history of different movements in Montreal and who was there and when. He was like, I'm not interested in that. I want to impart wisdom and through teaching stories. And that's where I got the title, A Sufi Sage of Montreal. And he is a serial murid. He, for example, early on in the chapter, he talks about a chance meeting with a Tibetan Lama in the line of a post office in Longueuil, Quebec. And he sees this guy in robes and he says, "Are you a Lama? Will you be my teacher?" So I call that section the Lama in Longueuil. And then he, Krebs, meets a Sufi Sam, Merchant Samuel Lewis. Somebody in his order is giving some talks in Montreal, and Krebs decides to do a 40-day retreat in Gaspé. So I call that section Seeking God in Gaspé. So I'm trying to have like all these Canadian content pieces. So he then subsequently, Joel, Ibrahim Krebs, is with Pir Vilayat Khan. Then he goes to Jerusalem and pursues instruction with Sidi Sheikh Jamal of the Shazaliya. So I call that section Islamization in Jerusalem. Then he becomes a staunch follower of Sheikh Nazim Haqqani with the Haqqanis. And then he goes with Nu Hamim Keller. So it's like all of these layers of Sufi movements that come to America, but they also come to Canada. And of course, there is this sort of piece in which ways Canadian spiritual seeking is linked at certain points to the West Coast, right? The Berkeley thing, or to New York, and people who go back and forth and cross borders, and different spiritual teachers establish their movements. Now Krebs is doing his own eclectic teaching. So I call that section the independent sheikh. So he has his own circle where he imparts what he's learned over the years. Because Ibrahim was not interested in the history of Sufism in Montreal, to flesh out the chapter, as Atif mentioned, I weave in some of my own experiences. And so the chapter is not only biographical, but it is also autobiographical. So some points that I can make that fascinate me about, thinking about these times that I went through. How did we ever network before cell phones and the internet? How did you know people were there? How did you meet them? So there is this pattern of like these chance, as Idrisha, these chance meetings in post office lines. So not just he had these kind of experiences, but I did too. Or of course, universities are prime set, you see a sign up, yoga meditation or something as a prime set. Or of course, back in the day, remember the occult bookstore? So it was like the occult, the Equinox bookstore in Toronto, right? So you would be able to network through those places. Now, there's a kind of sequencing in these movements in the Canadian context, and I'm not sure it may be a little different from the United States. So in my case, for example, it's from occultism to Eastern traditions, more in my case, Hindu yoga, to universal Sufism that has some kind of South Asian element, to Islamic Tariqa Sufism, and so on. In the case of Krebs, it's a little bit similar. He didn't do the occultism, but he was interested in Esalen and the human potential movement, and then Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism, and then universal Sufism, then Tariqa Sufi teachers. Then he did traditional Islam. By that point, I was an academic looking at traditional Islam, but I did run into Nur Hamdi Keller before he became famous. So there are many stories, some of which I do not tell in the chapter. And then actually Ibrahim ends up with a very ethnic Tunisian form of Sufism. He had a sheikh in Tunisia, and even there was a small group in Montreal of those Murids who Ibrahim says, it's just too ethnic, so that's about the Islamic practice, right? Like what is translatable, like if you do extremely long Arabic litanies, then, that's really not going to translate perhaps so well to Canadian spiritual seekers. So the chapter captures some of the diverse spiritual strands available to Canadians from the 70s to the present, noting trends, elements such as the importance of influences from the United States, that I already mentioned, West Coast and New York, the increase of international travel to the Middle East or South Asia. So you've got to really go, you've got to go and check out the real stuff overseas. And then, of course, they are coming. The Muslim immigrant teachers are coming to the West in increasing numbers. And so this chapter also demonstrates how some Sufi seekers in Canada gradually embrace forms of embodied Islamic practices and identities. So that's a summary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marcia. And definitely people, please do read her chapter. And I hope that we can, Marcia, have you write your memoirs. I think that will be a good book on Sufism on overall Canada. So yes, definitely a next project. Thank you so much. So Abdurrahman Malik, if you are available now to present your chapter, that would be great. And please do also have a little word about introducing yourself as well.
Thank you so much, Geneviève and Shobhana. I just want to echo the thanks and gratitude and appreciation and the honor that I personally feel having been invited to contribute to this amazing volume. And I think we all in the room recognize the amount of work and care and consideration that has gone into every chapter and the way that you've worked with each of us to really weave together some really beautiful and powerful stories and narratives and learnings. And just want to raise that up again and say thank you. And I also hope that the volume is generative, that it's the beginning of a lot more work. And from my point of view, sitting really at the edges, I think at times of the Academy, a lot more storytelling and Marcia. Your words just now, I think, have us all leaning in, wanting to hear even more stories. And I think that personal the biographical piece of this, the personal stories, the lived experience is really important. I think all of us will recognize the importance of that in generating knowledge. I come to this volume in an unusual way because it was through an encounter with Shobhana at AAR a few years ago that we began talking about what a contribution might look like. And my dear and beloved friend and teacher Atif Khalil is in the space, and listening to what you were saying, Atif, took me back to some of the original thinking around this chapter, which was really around the lived experience of a community of young people drawn from, I would almost say, a hyper diverse backgrounds. We were a hyper diverse group of people, representing almost every continent in terms of ethno-linguistic and national background. Many of us, first generation, born in Canada, and also, in a way, many of us having gone through what we might call a conversion experience. Many of us had grown up in Muslim communities, had grown up with Islamic practice, but it wasn't until we got to university and those heady days of the neo-traditionalist revolution, circa 1991 to 93, that I think for many of us, we each had our own sort of conversion moment. It's kind of an intentional moment where we not only embraced Islam anew, but also embraced Islamic spirituality and Sufism, not as something merely to be studied in a class with Professor Lawson, or to be read about in books and translations, but something that we would live. And I recall wandering the stacks of Robarts Library with Atif Khalil, and literally it wouldn't have been because we did a search in the card catalog, or at that time the very rudimentary computer system, but we knew where the Islam section was. And we would literally begin at one end of it and run our hands along the spines of the books. And anything that we would find interesting, we'd pull. And I remember this was hours of pulling volumes, of discoveries, of finding things that were so germane and inherent in our own tradition, but we were discovering them for the first time. And then this experience, as you described, Marcia, that Joel and others had, of meeting teachers and finding this intersection between learning the Islamic sciences and then realizing that all of that was just mood music for Islamic spirituality and the engagement and the experience with the divine that the Tasawwuf is. And I think from my perspective, because I sit here now at Yale Divinity School, really as a kind of an accidental unicorn academic, who is the only Muslim teaching Christian seminarians here at YDS, Foundations of Islam, and teaching a much more interesting and at times controversial course on Islam at the Intersections. I appreciate very much the what's happening in the academy, and also recognize that the academy is changing, and that autoethnography, autobiography, ethnography, and kind of a focus on lived experience is so important. And I think that's why this volume is so important. There's so much of that in there. None of the chapters seem distant or impersonal. They seem engaged, that all of you as scholars, and I feel like I'm in a room full of scholars, all of you are deeply engaged. And I think it's that engagement, it's that focus on lived experience, which makes this volume so important, and which I lean to in this sort of final epilogue-esque chapter, which really describes a kind of a lived experience. And Atif already referenced it in reference to our beautiful friend, sage and teacher Janice Orenstein, because out of the experience of organizing this program, which was called Light Upon Light in 1997, which was really it was like a coming out party for Sufis. it was like all of these things that we were doing. We'd go to the Jarahi gatherings, or we'd find the students of Habib Omar, or and at some mosque, or we'd have some Trinidadian or Guyanese Haqqani order in Scarborough, and then we'd be organizing our own sort of, we'd hack the zikrs and have our own at the University of Toronto, which we did every week, which combined Darqawi, Shadali, qasidas from Muhammad ibn Habib, and the wird of the awrad of the Ba'alawiya, and any other traditions that we were sort of grabbing from our teachers, and we were kind of making this stew, this Sufi zikr stew, and eating it every week and nourishing ourselves on it, and then finding that there were other traditions that had lineage and that had teachers, and trying to connect to them. Well, in a way, organizing this program, Light Upon Light, was a way for us to sort of come out to everyone and say, well, this is a real thing that we're participating in, and this is something that's happening in our communities, and it's the soul of our communities, which has often been obscured in our masajid because of Salafi Dawa, or because of Ikhwani Jamaati prejudices against the spiritual life. Many of those prejudices which I grew up with, being a son of a Jamiat member myself. And yet, coming from a family of Sufi murids and adepts, my grandparents all were, that this was a kind of a really important moment. And alongside of it was also this broader, what many studies, of course, are now calling the neo-traditionalist movement, or the neo-traditionalist revolution that was happening, which has had a profound impact on the organization of Muslim religious life in North America, certainly, and beyond. I don't think we can underestimate that. Atif, I lean into you on this, because I often feel that we ourselves don't recognize that the activism that was going on in the early 90s to create these kinds of spaces has actually, over the last 35 years, had an absolutely profound and transformative impact on the entire landscape of the way we engage religion and Islam as a confessional faith, and as a lived experience. And I think it's interesting to have been able to have been given this opportunity. And thank you, Shobhana and Geneviève, again, to reflect on that. Like, what does that mean looking back on it? But also, what were some of the dynamics in organizing these spaces that I think now, looking back on it, and certainly over the last many years, appear to me to be concerning. And so in the chapter, I try to look at issues around gender and inclusion. I try to look at issues around the way in which we brought in, but also marginalized voices from Shia communities, how our language was so Sunni specific, and yet our aspiration was inclusive, and that how we were unable to square that circle, partially because of youth, partially because of arrogance and lack of humility, part of knowledge, but also because I think we can look back on it and see that some of these things were institutionalized within our understanding of Islam and Muslim communities. And so, to conclude, for me, the chapter was actually an incredible self-discovery. We found a copy of Light Upon Light. We transcribed it. We listened to it. We digitized it. And for me, it was also a way to revisit, I think, some of these issues with friends and colleagues who had been involved in it. And for me also, I think, as a space, a beginning space, as I said earlier, this is something emergent, that it sort of represents a kind of an opportunity to begin to look back and explore, but also then to understand where the framing of Islamic spirituality sits today. And especially as we are in this frightfully fractious period, almost dystopian period, and to quote Cornel West, a period of spiritual blackout and breakdown. What do these movements and our experiences over the last 35 years have to say to us as we imagine new ways of spiritual and religious formation to meet the challenges of the day? So it's an eminently practical discussion for me, and I want to thank our editors again, and to all of you for including me in this space. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very nice exploration of really the meaningfulness of writing from the lived experience. And I think you're perfectly correct that every chapter in this edited volume really comes from that perspective. Not only because there is very little scholarship on Sufism in Canada, so we had to write it from the lived experience, but also because I think everyone, the scholars that have contributed to this edited volume are in, I think, this approach really of not only knowing from scholarly books, but also knowing from within. And this is going to bring me to our next presenter, who's Nem Jamba, who also did field work in Montreal. So Nem, I'm going to pass the mic to you. And also after that, I'll be calling Amina to speak about her chapter. So go ahead, Nem.
Good to see you, and thanks again for inviting me to contribute to this volume. And I'm very happy with the way it's come out and everything that is coming out of it, and all the encounters that I've made, and especially with the Shobhana and more with Marcia and etc. And I'm very indebted because this is basically one way in which I could reinvest the research that I did for my master's thesis years ago on the Montreal Sufi Center, where I was really trying to learn how to do ethnography, and sort of chose the Sufi Center almost, because I thought it would be strategic, and I knew Montreal, and I thought I could be just going to one place and trying to learn as much as I could on initially what I took to be self-presentation practices and politics of what makes us Sufi, etc. And this obviously evolved, took many directions, and took me to continue doing doctoral work nowadays at McGill, where I've focused instead on lodges in Europe, and have been working on the idea of spiritual connection with the master, in the way it takes on several scales and several dimensions and adds into different elements, which all in their own way embody the spiritual connection and make it something that people both develop as a culture and as a personal ethos. And so, but at this level, what I've explored is sort of trying to synthesize what the Sufi Center has taught me in terms of how we would understand what Sufism means, or what we mean when we speak of Sufism in the face of a landscape such as the West. I mean, broadly speaking, where you have different forms of Sufism as Marcia and Shobhana and Mark Sedgwick's work, which would tell you time and again that are basically in tension more or less with one another, and or not, but also revealing that what might be Sufi for one isn't Sufi for another, and etc. So there's this whole dimension of where Sufism is really something about the fringes and the margins and the limitations and things like that. And so what I've come to notice with work at the Sufi Center, and also with reading the literature over and again, is how, in fact, you can have a case like the Naqshbandi Haqqani, where all of the possible ways that we could speak of Sufism are imbricated and made, to really live, atop or superimpose on one another. And so I'll just read the notes that I wrote on this, and I have many other things to say. I'm very indebted to the Sufi Center. It's a place I really like, and I keep going there, and I keep, drinking from their well, as they say. But for now, I'm just going to say that the title of my chapter pays tribute to one of my early acquaintances with sociological literature on Sufism in the West, Marcia Hermanson's What is American? About American Sufi movements. And I was drawn to Hermanson's work on many levels, but one of the notions that I really liked is that notion of hybridity when speaking of Sufi movements that were neither fully diasporic nor fully local, and could thus transcend enclaves of either in ethnic backgrounds and cultures or ideology with regards to spirituality. By asking what is Sufi about a place which evidently defines itself as such, I am also picking up on things I had learned from my very first period of ethnographic fieldwork in 2012, both at the Montreal Sufi Center and among the largely Western-based Naqshbandi Haqqani Sufi movement in general. I'm just saying that this basically started a whole bunch of fieldwork that I've kept on doing, which I had later resumed in different lodges across Europe for the doctoral research I am now hoping to finish very soon, inshallah. And as I say in the chapter itself, the term Sufi is not only polyvocal, but one, as you would say, Xavier, Shobhana, and Rory Dixon, and other people, is not only polyvocal, but one which tends to find itself questioned or put to the test by practitioners in places like the Sufi Center, whether as a way of affecting humility in a very Sufi fashion, incidentally, by saying that few are worthy of calling themselves Sufi, or as a way of emphasizing the importance given to an understanding that refuses any distinction between Sufism and Islam, including and particularly in terms of orthodoxy and authenticity, which does not consider Sufism as a matter of deepening and giving meaning to one's Islam. So basically tariqa Sufism. So Sufism as Islam and as commitment to a lineage of masters who are here to represent the light of the Prophet and teach it in its full weight. But tariqa Sufism does not mean that Sufism on stage, Sufism in restaurants, Sufism in decoration, Sufism in basically self-help literature cannot be linked to it, even if you might have, the semblance of debates and tension on that level. The Sufi Center and the Naqshbandi movement behind them provide a wonderful example of not only hybridity in Hermans' sense of origins and influences brought to coexist and share the same following, but also the fact that what could seem like a set of conflicting approaches to what one might mean when speaking or displaying Sufism or Muslim piety or spirituality can in fact coexist and even thrive by imbricating themselves in one another. To this, I draw on an exploration of the possibilities offered by one of Irving Goffman's later works, Frame Analysis, an essay on the organization of experience. It's a classic, but I was very influenced when I was writing my master's. So by the resurgences of interest for this author at the HESS at the time where I was doing my master's thesis in anthropology, I show how changes in setting, for example, or the addition of a few elements is given settings and situations in given settings can yield to dramatic shifts in the form of, or facet of Sufism being witnessed altogether. So for example, when I speak of in the chapter of when I follow this this musical formation, the Burda ensemble, it's what fascinates me is how I can see it from the standpoint, at a festival as something that reveals a performance of Sufi heritage, and the fact that I could just very simply put hear and see and witness the same songs and dances at the Sufi Center, taking a completely different meaning, where you're revealed of its full spiritual and mystical weight as something that people experience in the form of as a manifestation of the connection to the Prophet. And in the same way, the center also has this way of like having, allowing for various levels of meanings to whatever is done in the center. And so, for example, food at the center can be taken for what it is as a, okay. So, for example, when food is like a matter of conviviality and making sure that a congregation is thriving, but it can also have Sufi meanings in the form of like the barakah that is shared by the meal, the ethos of service, of giving and sharing. And so it's basically, a portrait of how I was taught by Sufis to really see the layers of meanings behind what gets done. essentially. So then, and that would be one take on Zahir and Batin, and I can go on, and I've been beyond time, and thank you very much. So I could say the same of like the fact that it's a Friday, on Fridays it's a mosque, and then when you come on Thursday night, you can see that it's really a zawiya of Sheikh Nazim and his legacy because of the form of the zikr and things like that. So yeah, so, and it's also a zawiya for many other aspects, and yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your chapter was a really important contribution to the book and could really translate well the years of research that you spent at the Zawiya. So thank you very much for your contribution as well. So now I'm going to call Amina Jama, who co-wrote a chapter with Mariam Khan, who's not here, but they co-wrote this chapter together. It was also a very amazing contribution. So Amina, up to you. Now the floor is yours.
Hi, my name, I'm Amina Jamal, as Geneviève has already introduced me, and I teach at Toronto Metropolitan University. And the reason why I'm included in this is because I teach a course on women, Islam, and modernity. And Mariam Khan and I have worked together on other things, and Mariam, who is identifies as a lesbian Muslim cis woman, and who is has become involved in Sufism and interested in Sufism more recently, a different generation than me. And we've had many conversations about Sufism. This is an auto-ethnographic piece, so I'm going to talk more, in those terms, in that language. What was interesting for me when I came to TMU, and I also, this is the moment where I want to thank the editors of this book, really deeply thank them, because when I started teaching this course in 2007, it was already a course that had been designed and created by some very well-known feminist writers on Islam and Muslim identity in Canada. And I started, when the first time I taught the course, I was surprised that there was nothing about Sufism, because that's the Islam that I know. I've grown up in, and I've mentioned in my chapter, it was like a river in which I opened my eyes, because my mother traces her lineage to Sufi Ahmad Abdul Haq, who's a Sufi from the Chishti Sabri generation. And we, as children, we used to visit the shrine in Rudoli. We keep in touch. My cousins and everyone would always be sending us these, what we call tabarrukat, these gifts, which were comprised of the dried flowers and the dupatta, scarves and things that were on the shrine of the saint. So as children, we knew that. And so I felt that there needs to be something about Sufism. So this, I turned to Fatma Marnisi, Chitek, and Marie Chamel, and now I think this book is going to really help me present Sufism from different ways. And I also want to share one really interesting thing that most of my students, I just finished a class yesterday, and when I asked, I have obviously a session on Sufism, and when I asked them if they've heard of it, most of the students have not heard of it. Those who have, even in TMU, which is largely, the class is largely Muslims, South Asian Muslims, and others, of course, plus obviously the class is welcome. I have others who may have heard about Sufism, but not the Muslim students, interestingly. Especially South Asian Muslims have never heard of Sufism. Even if they have, most of them think that it is a modern Islam, a Western kind of Islam, or they think that it is a particular sect, which they think that they should, some of the Shia students are identified with, but the Sunnis usually feel that it is not really Islamic, and so all those discussions. So I was really, that's why I think I'm also going to use our piece. I'm not a scholar of Sufism, so it's just that I've lived in a household that was just steeped with Sufi practices. We've celebrated the anniversary, death anniversary of every, almost every saint. Our dinner table conversation was Rumi and Hafiz and all those things. My father would be explaining that. So, and also we were taught to say our prayers because my father was came from a specific tradition, Frangi Mahal, where they, which was unusual in South Asia because they believed equally in it was a madrasa and they followed the Sharia and all, but they also, it was steeped in Sufism. And we have stories about how they turned to Sufism. One of the skeptics of the family went to Basa Sharif, and when the saint there looked at him, he just, he saw something that made him believe in divine love and the Sufi tradition. So I've heard stories and all. So I felt the students should know that. So Mariam and I decided to do this chapter in a way also to demonstrate the difference between, those difference that migration has made in the lives of many Muslims here, young Muslims, and also to demonstrate the global political changes that, since the 1980s, which even in Pakistan, and as I think Abdul Rahman said, how Sufism is seen as the Wahhabi narrative actually has completely become the main narrative, and Sufism has become a fringe narrative, which was totally the opposite of what it was when I was growing up, because most of my friends, we did all these practices and nobody ever thought that what we were doing was Sufism. It was just Islam. And so Mariam and I decided to collaborate on this and to bring out all these political, social, global dimensions, especially the Afghan war, the Saudi connection with the West, and how that has geopolitically changed, the understanding of Islam among young Muslims. And in that, of course, also we have some regional issue in Pakistan, regional matters and influences also happen, issues. For example, the rise of the discovery of oil and these petro dynasties, and the migration of hundreds and thousands of immigrant and laborers to the Gulf states, and they're bringing back these, there's sudden understanding that what we were practicing was not true Islam, and so how Wahhabism really crept into the lives of ordinary young Muslims all over the world, in Pakistan and here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amina, and thank you for both of your contribution to this chapter, which is a really amazing conversation between two scholars who've lived through this transformation. So this is also a chapter that really explores a different kind of academic, really, understanding and exploration of Sufism. So thank you for that. Now, I'm just going to mention we have 3 contributors that are not here present that couldn't make it, but we have Emily Victoria Hanlon, who explored a chapter on the MTO Shamasudi order from Iran to Canada and the different centers they have across Canada. And then we have Sarah Abdel Latif, who also who did a chapter on Sufism and poetry in the Canadian context by reviewing the old Sufi stories through 3 Canadian writers. And then we have a final chapter by Alia O'Brien, Branches of Sound, the Orality of Safety in Sufi Toronto, that also explores her own navigations of 2 different practices of Sufism in the context of Toronto. So thank you so much again for all our contributors. We're so grateful, Shobhana and I. And now I'm going to turn to Mark Sedgwich, who's been extremely generous to respond to the book and kind of offer also his, a bit of a, perspective on the contribution of this volume. So Mark Sedgwich is a professor of Arab and Islamic Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark, and he is also the chair of the Nordic Society for Middle Eastern Studies and president of the European Network for the Study of Islam and Esotericism. His PhD was on the development of a group of Sufi orders deriving from Ibn Idris in the Arab world and in Malaysia. And since then, he has been working on Sufism and esotericism alongside other issues from regime legitimacy to terrorism. His best-known book is Against the Modern World, Traditionalism and the Secret Intellectual History of the 20th Century, published by Oxford University Press in 2004, which has been translated into various languages, including Turkish, Persian, and Russian. His other books include Western Sufism, From the Abbasids to the New Age, published in 2016, and most recently, Traditionalism, The Radical Project to Restore Sacred Order, published in 2023. So thank you again, Mark, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to comment on this book. I think it's a great book, obviously, and it's great also to have met not all of the authors, but many of the authors who I didn't already know, and in this setting. Why do I think it's great? Well, I think one of the reasons why I think it's great is that it finally gives Sufism in Canada a wider treatment. I mean, we did have one book before this, but there really was very little about this. And as you mentioned, I wrote a book on Western Sufism, and this morning I Googled it. I searched it, and I discovered that the word Canada didn't appear at all, which is rather embarrassing in this company. But what I can say in my defense is that this was partly because in that book I was trying to put everything together, so I was quite often building on existing work. And at that point, there just wasn't any existing work to build on. And nothing to suggest an angle that I might pursue myself, nothing to suggest somewhere I might go. So that's, of course, the first reason why I think this book is amazing. But I mean, it's not just ticking the box that North America includes Canada. It is also raising the issue of how Sufism in Canada is different from the way it appears in other countries. Most of the work that has been done has been on various bits of Europe and on the United States. I myself did some work on Sufism in Latin America and South America for the book on Sufism in Western contexts. So it was edited by Marcia and Saeed Zarabizadeh, where Rory, nice to see you again, wrote the section for the regional bits, wrote the section on North America. But there wasn't a section on Canada specifically at that point. What I found when I was looking at South America, so the opposite end of the continent, was that it was very interesting to see the sequence of development of South American Sufism, which spanned 100 years, because the first inayatis established themselves in 1922. But it raised the whole question of distance and the position of Latin America in relation to other parts of the world. So originally, 1922, Sufism comes from Europe. And then for a long time after that, it tended to come from the United States, partly for geographical reasons, because it's a lot easier to get from South America to the United States than it was in those days to get to Europe. Somebody was telling me how long and how many flights to change it had taken them to get from Buenos Aires to Istanbul. So, you know, this is something not very many people did. But although a lot of the orders came from the US, they sometimes developed in different directions. And then towards the end of this period, we started getting entirely indigenous movements, of which the most unusual, I might say, was the so-called the tradition, which was run by the brother of Idris Shah, who generally pops up occasionally, but we didn't really discover very much about what he actually did. And that was really, really interesting. Another thing that came up, which is going to bring me back to Canada, is when one's looking at different regions, something that changes things is the growth of people who were brought up as Muslims, so non-converts, and that in Latin America is quite striking because there are still very few born Muslims in Latin America. So people can get away with saying all sorts of things that would be challenged in other countries. And I think that what really struck me about Canada is the extent to which people of Muslim origin are involved in it, which seems to be much more the case, certainly more the case than anywhere in South America, but actually more the case than often than in Europe even today. But that's not the only reason why I think this is a great book. I think it also does something quite special methodologically, because there is a tendency, and I'm guilty of this myself, to do single order studies, single order historical studies. Now, we have some of them in this collection, which is very good. It's necessary, and it's also often very interesting. But we also have a number of different approaches. And I think the range of approaches that is represented in this book, the range of alternative approaches, is something that makes it very special. There are different angles taken, and also the way in which there's this sort of semi-autobiographical elements. I didn't actually count, but the number of people who are talking about what they themselves experienced is striking, and in some ways solves the a sort of insider-outsider problem, because the standard approach is very much outsider, or perhaps in many cases isn't really outsider, it's the suspension of insiderness, because there are a lot of people whose interest in Sufism stems from something personal, and people are not always entirely open about this. And sometimes the insider approach can be problematic, as all of us who've worked with autobiographical material and material coming out of the orders themselves. But this is not the case here in this volume. What I find is that we've got a solution to another problem, which is that we who work on Sufism, we all know what it is because we've experienced it ourselves. And that means that when we're reading somebody else's work, we read it in a certain way. But there are a lot of people, I mean, as we were hearing, there are all these students who don't know what Sufism is, and this is what I experienced when I was teaching at the American University in Cairo. People whose grandparents had certainly been Sufis had no idea, except they thought that it was something about worshipping stones, a bit like Hinduism or something like that. So there are an awful lot of people who need to know what Sufism is. And I think a lot of the contributions in this collection are extremely successful in doing that, in giving the novice reader a taste of what actually happens in Sufism, and certainly in Sufism in Canada, but I mean also for Sufism more widely, and that this can help the novice reader, the student, whatever, understand what's going on much better than many other books on the subject. So that's really what I wanted to say. It's a great book for at least two reasons, possibly three. I wasn't really counting how many that was. So I hope lots of people read it. And thank you for asking me to say a few words on the topic.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was really appreciated, and I think it really brings together the contributions of everyone in this volume and its significance. So thank you again for responding. Now Shobhana will take on the last part, which will be really a session for everyone to be able to, ask questions, discuss commentaries. Feel free to space where we can just kind of chat.
Thank you so much, everybody. Just hearing everybody's chapters reminded me of like reading them for the first time and how exciting it was to receive such amazing work. And I really appreciate Mark engaging the work and being so attuned to it. And I do agree with Mark, even though I probably have no objectivity in the matter, but the methodological just variance of the chapters was just so exciting. And I think as someone who's really committed to this field, I hope people take that away as like just the range of things you can do with the topic, which I think is so exciting that everybody did so well. So we have a few minutes left, and I'm happy to take questions. You could either type them in the chat box, or you could put up your hands and we will redirect them. And you could have the space to ask specifically to any of our contributors, to Mark or to the editors. But yeah. And we do have a book to give away. So at the end, we will select somebody and we'll send a book to you, or I'll send a book to you. So yeah. But you don't have to ask a question to be selected to get a book. We won't make you do that. Questions, comments, even from our contributors to each other. Joseph, please go ahead. Nice to see you.
Hey, everybody. I was hoping to have been part of this issue and of this volume, and you invited me to be part of it, and I had nothing that was actually ready in the time frame that was required. But so I'm sorry I was unable to get you something. But I don't know if I really have a specific question. I just want to say I'm really excited about this volume, and I want to thank you all for putting it together. And I think we really need more work like this in the study of Islam and Sufism in Canada. I guess if I have one question, I'm actually starting a project here with a student and a colleague on studying Islamic knowledge networks in Edmonton, and we're focusing mostly on traditionalists, not in Professor Sedgwick's concept of traditionalism, but more in the Islamic traditionalism sense of the word, in terms of how people are spreading knowledge. Usually, things like fiqh, traditional fiqh, and so on. And one of the things that I found is that if you look at the academic literature on Sufism, you very often have the sense that Sufism is, it's like a branch of Islam where, like Professor Sedgwick was saying, like people think of it as something that's completely different. But if you look at the actual networks, a lot of it is very much like, it's not like a big old center with a big sign that Sufis are here. When I moved to Edmonton with my wife, she said, I kind of want to connect. She's from Egypt. I want to connect to the Sufis here. And so we looked it up, and, we found the Sufi International and that kind of stuff. And well, it turns out that like the vast majority of Sufis are people who are just kind of under the surface. They go to the mosque, they look like everybody else. They're just like, they consider themselves average Muslims, like some of you are suggesting. But what I'm wondering is, how do we as scholars of this tradition get past the I like the idea of Sufi studies, but I find that a lot of the literature on Sufism in the academia suggests that it's kind of like there's the mainstream Islam and then there's Sufism. Even if we know that's not true, just even the way we title our works and the way we talk about it, have conferences and so on Sufism. And what I'm finding with the networks here is that it's very often hard to tell, even after talking to somebody many times, whether the person's a Sufi or not, because it's kind of like, saying yoga practitioner or jogger or something. It's Sufism is it's an activity they do, but it's not necessarily like, their religious persuasion. It's just like how they affiliate in there. And I found that it's much more to be just kind of like part of the Islamic practice that people have if they're part of the kind of traditionalist Islam. So I don't know, it sounds to me like you've addressed this to a large extent in your chapter. So I'm looking forward to, I don't know if it's explicitly, but you're addressing places, these kinds of questions. But I'm just wondering what, if you have any thoughts about that. How do we kind of break down this, these apparent divides, which in the real world often aren't really there?
I don't know if anybody wants to jump in to respond. As an initial thought, as you were speaking, I was thinking of Amina and Mariam's chapter and also Abdul Rahman Malik's chapter, because I think both of their chapters really are getting at this issue of, there's maybe a cultural or religious inheritance, but the outside world beyond that, because of various reasons, has some sense of binary or avoidance of the use of that term, even though that is integrated. And I think part of this also in academia is kind of the Orientalist legacy of the study of Sufism in the field versus kind of folks wanting to engage. And I know, my supervisor, Mina Sharifi Funk, always used to say there's a tendency to kind of throw the baby with the bathwater out when you're kind of critiquing Orientalist kind of legacy. But when you think of scholars like Anne-Marie Schimmel or many of the greats who have informed the field, I think there is a need to kind of inquire about where the tension is, and some of it is theological, and I wonder some of it is like intellectual anxieties about the genealogies of the fields we exist in and how to bridge them. And I'm hoping that because so many of the scholars we brought together were sociologists and religious studies scholars and Islamic studies scholars, ethnomusicologists, one of your own students, it is interesting to see people coming at it from different disciplinary bounds that perhaps are not as constrained as Islamic studies or religious studies is. I don't know if that resonates with other folks or other folks have thoughts on that, but that's Naeem?
Okay, I'm muted. I wonder if there could be, after all, shorthand ways of saying this is Sufi, which we gravitate around quite a bit in all of our works, which is, when you say, for example, there's a saint, there's a shrine, there's a lineage, there's almost a profession of sainthood and the tradition of it. I'm wondering if we couldn't, after all, say the Sufism is the Islam of the saints and Islam that the saints will teach, or the awliya, or these lineages, because it might allow us, after all, to encompass the varieties of possible meanings of Sufism. So it's just a question I'm throwing out there, maybe in response. Yeah.
Amina?
Yeah, good point.
Thanks. I think we need to understand, maybe because I'm a critical race theorist, post-colonial scholar, and a feminist theorist, I think we need to understand the deeply political, underlying political issue between this, in this binary oppositional construction between Sufism and what is called Islam. I would call it just Salafism or Wahhabism, actually. In South Asia, this has been a very long history between Barelvis and Deobandis, and it has, taken on many, sometimes violent forms. Barelvis are those who are closer to the Sufi practices, so they do follow some of the Sufi practices as, going to shrines and graves and so forth. At this point in time, I think it is really due to the imperialist dominance of the US and its, the complicity of the Gulf state, many Muslim states, especially Saudi Arabia. So in Pakistan, for example, and in South Asia, we can say that this happened since this question of Wahhabism and burial and Sufism. People have written about it, and my own ancestors, the Frangi Mahalis and others have written about it, and also sent the teams of Muslims who went to Saudi Arabia and then came back and reported on Wahhabism in the 1920s and things like that. But as we can see in my own experience and others, this world that we are living in, the US actually used Wahhabism in the war in Afghanistan against, against Soviet Unions, constructing Islam, it as a jihad against godless communism. And then now that after 9/11, they're promoting Sufism. So you can, I believe in Saudi Arabia too, there are some strains of, they are allowing certain Sufi things. So I think that is, we cannot ignore that, because it is a larger and age-old question of authority construction. Is it the state? It's between like an ongoing struggle between the state, the mullahs, for want of a better word, and the Sufi saint, and who has the largest hold over the masses. I think that's something that for me is very important to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mark?
Just like to add just something to what you said about the Orientalist tradition, which is that I think there in the early Orientalist tradition, there are two sort of schools of thought. At the very beginning, we have Orientalist scholars who are themselves Universalists, and some of whose work actually inspired, I think, Inayat Khan. And if you want to be a Universalist, it's a bit difficult to have Sufism as A, universal, and B, an integral part of Islam at the same time. So the Universalist tendency does indeed tend to construct Sufism as separate. The other approach that comes a bit after this, and that a lot of people will spend a lot of time with in the 19th century, is looking at Sufi philosophy and theology, because that's what people in faculties of theology, where a lot of this work is going on, that's what they find interesting. Now, of course, Sufi philosophy and theology has to be different from Islamic philosophy and theology, because otherwise it's not a separate thing that you can study. I don't think that these guys, I mean, they weren't terribly interested in real life or social realities or anything like that. But I think to the extent that they weren't really constructing a socially separate and socially different Sufism. They were just interested in one particular aspect of it. But that does give us a certain legacy, which is, even if the reasons were not terribly problematic, the consequence is a bit problematic.
Zabine, do you have a question or telling us to wrap up?
I have a question.
Okay, so you'll be the last question. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I'm so looking forward to reading this collection of interesting essays under this title of Sufism in Canada. My research is focused on Sikhs in Canada, and have a growing interest in Sufism through the lens of Sikhism in the Canadian context, especially being here in the prairies, where there's a growing Punjabi Muslim population. And I'm wondering if you can speak to kind of the geographical component of Sufism in Canada, the diversity. Is the impression I get is that Sufism in Canada has a startup quality. There's like a pop-up kind of experience here, especially with the I heard this phrase independent shake. I think of like the entrepreneurial kind of component of that. And I'm wondering if it's easier to pop up Sufism in certain geographical areas in Canada, and are the prairies acknowledged at all in this text?
That's a great question. So we don't have a chapter that looks particularly at the prairies. Most of the chapters end up having an urban center focus, which is really interesting. Naeem's chapter had this great phrasing of storefront Sufism, which I think is really, really cool to think about how historically a lot of Black Christian churches, when they moved from the south to the north, also had this mentality of integrating into available spaces. My chapter, which I didn't talk about, is the focus is on the West Coast and the North Pacific and the Cascadia region and the entanglement of Sufism with nature and eco-spirituality. But yeah, there is an element, I think, of overlap in terms of this entrepreneurial spirit of how do you like establish and how do you set up shop ultimately, right? And I think this is also, and I think your work does a really great job of critiquing this of just because something is like going through like becoming commodified, it doesn't actually lose the practice of it. Whereas I think there's a tendency where we think that when things are being consumed, there's like a dilution of the consumption, especially in terms of its sacred capacity, maybe. But kind of the blurring of lines of what constitutes ritual, what constitutes sacred, an urban kind of rural landscape. I think these are all some things that are coming up. And some of the chapters deal with it really, really well, especially in terms of digital forms of Sufism, which Emily's chapter dealt with really interesting in terms of how are they presenting themselves online, what kind of environmental based organizations are they aligning with, not setting up, but actually aligning with integrating. And I do see that as a sustainability reality, not environmental sustainability, but institutional and Sufi sustainability. What are mechanisms in place already that communities are trying to tap into in order to be a startup, like in order to network and establish kind of social capital, which is such a really fascinating thing. And I think it's a thread that I hope more people pick up on. And I think I think it also kind of says much about the historical origins of Sufism in regions like South Asia and North Africa and around the world. I think we have a tendency to perceive Sufism in very pristine ways when it arrives into, the North America, the global North, but we don't realize that historically, as you were saying, there was so much hybridity and syncretism that why is it okay in kind of a natal context, but it's not okay in the point of like migration and in diasporic communities. It seems like we have different standards of expectation of authenticity in some places and not others. And I hope that kind of answers or begins to answer. I think Atif had a point to say, and then we'll kind of wrap up.
Yeah, thank you. No, I thought that was an important question about what exactly Sufism is. I think there's much more attention given to this question in Western scholarship that warrants when we look at it from an Islamic point of view in the Islamic world. I mean, even if you look at it from a purely textual point of view, if you look at early texts, so-called Sufi texts, they'll give you like 100 definitions of what Sufism is, which makes it virtually impossible to define what exactly it is that we are talking about. And I myself, I actually find it problematic to situate Sufism as a very specific historical phenomena that emerges in the middle of the 9th century, because many of the people who we think of as so-called Sufis wouldn't have identified themselves as Sufis. Even Ibn Arabi, who we think of as the greatest Sufi, or many would think of as the greatest Sufi theoretician, he says the Sufis are not the highest saints. He says the highest saints are the Malamatiyah. And he says the Sufis are actually below them, right? So I think there's much more made of the category than warrants when we look at the phenomena of Sufism, however defined in the Islamic world. I would like to hear what Marcia and Rory have to say about this, because they've written considerably on this subject. If we have time. Sufism, what is it?
1 minute each. I'm starting the clock.
Marcia, I'll defer to you on this one. So
I think my jet lag is kicking in, but I'm not sure like what what is Sufism? Well, I guess the question comes out in the study of Western Sufism, because there have been a number of groups that have explicitly said, well, it really doesn't have to do, it is not exclusively tied to Islam, right? Is it a kind of universal spirit, you know, kind of the religion before religion, or the original mystical experience, and it's there in every tradition, and everybody recognizes, every evolved spiritual person recognizes that core, and the Sufis within Islam would recognize that in the, you know, that would be a sort of Western Sufi, right? A universalist Sufi view. So you actually had these fusion figures like Sam Lewis. So there was this kind of, he was a Zen Roshi, and or Lex Hickson, right? People who are kind of both, and whatever they were within a tradition. Yes, there was a tradition, there was something authentically there, but they could get to the core of it. So there's that idea, right? In a lot of Islamic thought, it's like, what is at the core? And it depends where you are, who you think is on the periphery, and who you think is at the core. That might be a helpful place to start. Like, do you need to have a core, or do you need to have a structure? In other words, if there's no specific tradition that Sufism belongs to, then sort of what does it hang on? Like, what is it embodied in? So we're back to kind of practices and embodiment and experience. If you don't have that, what is it that you're talking about? So that's the tension. Like, how can you study that core experience? I mean, I think it's a fundamental dynamic in religious studies, right? Like where do you start, and do you need to prioritize or give a hierarchy of what is the most important? And I think if you lined up different spiritual teachers, or different Sufi teachers, shall we say, that we're speaking about, professor, you know, those who profess Sufism, they would have their own individual ways of thinking about it, and that's why it's complicated, right? Because the different individuals have different perspectives of what that means, what's core and what is more peripheral or less necessary. I'll stop.
Just maybe really quickly, I think partly to Atif and Joe's question, you know, you could argue there's kind of a mistranslation of tasawwuf as Sufism, and I think that's like language is definitely a problem here, right? Tasawwuf is a discipline, you know, it's a process, and so we can think of it like fiqh or something, right? So you don't really think of like fiqh studies and Islamic studies as being somehow separate, because fiqh has this kind of, you know, connotation of discipline, which tasawwuf has, but Sufism, you know, that has a whole set of other connotations with the ism, and I think that's probably partly at root here as well, is that the way that tasawwuf has been translated. But that's all I'll say about that.
It becomes problematic when we have Sufism being distinguished from Islamic mysticism. Because, for example, there's this book I'm reading right now. It's about mysticism in Andalusia in the 12th century, but the author doesn't want to call it Sufism, right? So, you know, it's just like, well, is Sufism mysticism? Is it not mysticism? But questions for another forum, I guess, another conference, a Zoom discussion.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. Sorry, they're cutting a tree at the back, and I don't know if you could hear all that noise. Of course, they're doing it now. Sabine, do you want to give me a number? And I'm just going to count, and then I'll give this book away to somebody. I'll mail it. It has to be 1 to 15, because that's
1 to 15. Okay, yeah. Let's go with 13.
Joe, the book is coming to you. It's funny because you're trying to order it too. So yeah,
I guess I won't have to worry about that discount.
You don't have to worry about it. I will email you to get a mailing address, and I will post it in the mail for you. Thank you all so much. And thank you for celebrating this edited volume. The contributions are amazing, and I'm really just grateful for the opportunity to see you all and virtually and celebrate. And thank you, Mark, for being with us today all the way from Denmark to celebrate as well. Thank you, folks. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mark. Be here, everyone.
Naeem.